The universe, it turned out, had a bureaucracy problem. Not the usual kind involving paperwork and incompetent middle management, though those existed in abundance throughout the galaxy's various governmental structures. No, this was a more fundamental issue. The entire cosmic community had become obsessed with ranking everything that could conceivably destroy everything else, and they'd turned this obsession into both an art form and a spectator sport. The Universal Dominion scale was the crown jewel of this organizational madness, a comprehensive catalogue of every entity, force, and cosmic horror capable of unmaking reality on a Tuesday afternoon. The scale didn't just list these beings, it ranked them with the kind of meticulous attention to detail typically reserved for tax audits or the dietary requirements of particularly neurotic houseplants. Each entry included threat assessments, dimensional impact studies, and detailed analyses of exactly how many civilizations could expect to cease existing if the entity in question woke up on the wrong side of the cosmic bed. At the absolute pinnacle of this monument to institutionalized paranoia lurked Void Render Maltheos, a designation that managed to sound both impressively terrifying and like the stage name of a death metal band that had taken itself too seriously. Maltheos wasn't merely dangerous in the conventional sense of being able to blow up planets or reorganize solar systems for aesthetic purposes. He was a sentient storm of dark matter that existed primarily in the spaces between spaces, feeding on the conceptual framework of reality itself and occasionally manifesting in normal dimensions when he felt like reminding the universe that physics was more of a polite suggestion than an actual rule. The scale's custodians, a consortium of species who'd achieved galactic prominence through the twin virtues of being insufferably self-important and having tentacles in all the right political places, took immense pride in their work. They'd created subcategories for every conceivable type of cosmic threat: reality shapers, dimension devourers, entropy accelerators, and the particularly troublesome category of things that shouldn't exist but do anyway out of pure spite. The ranking system was supported by the Supremacy Trials, a series of ritualistic challenges that served the dual purpose of maintaining cosmic order and providing entertainment for beings whose idea of a good time involved watching lesser entities attempt to prove their worthiness to exist in the same universe as their betters. These trials took place in specially constructed reality-warping arenas, where the laws of physics went to contemplate their life choices and occasionally wrote strongly worded resignation letters. The whole system worked beautifully, providing structure, hierarchy, and most importantly, a clear understanding of who could atomize whom and under what circumstances. It was elegant, comprehensive, and had been functioning smoothly for approximately 3 billion years. Then humanity showed up and in typical human fashion immediately began asking inconvenient questions. Humanity's discovery of faster-than-light travel had been something of a cosmic accident, achieved through what their scientists had termed aggressive improvisation, and what the rest of the galaxy would later classify as the kind of reckless experimentation that should have resulted in the Earth becoming a small, rapidly expanding cloud of exotic particles. Instead, humans had somehow managed to punch holes in space-time using what appeared to be equal parts advanced mathematics, stubborn determination, and a concerning disregard for the concept of impossible. Their first contact with galactic civilization had been memorable. The hegemony's finest diplomatic minds had prepared elaborate first contact protocols, philosophical exchanges about the nature of existence, and carefully structured presentations about humanity's place in the cosmic order. The humans had responded by asking if anyone had Wi-Fi, and immediately starting a heated debate about whether the aliens' translation software was accurately conveying the subtle differences between irritated and mildly peeved. Within a week, they'd somehow convinced half the diplomatic corps that Earth music was surprisingly complex for a pre-transcendent species, and had started what would later be known as the Great Percussion Incident of Galactic Standard Year 4847, an event that required 3 emergency sessions and a complete revision of the Geneva Convention sections on acoustic warfare. The cosmic community had eventually granted humanity observer status in galactic affairs, which was the diplomatic equivalent of saying, We'll let you watch the important people make decisions, but please don't touch anything expensive and try not to hurt yourselves. Most species viewed humans as a mildly amusing curiosity. A species that had somehow achieved interstellar travel, despite appearing to be governed by a combination of caffeine dependency, reality television, and the inexplicable belief that all problems could be solved through the application of sufficient enthusiasm and duct tape, which made the current situation all the more entertaining. Dr. Phoenix Blackwater stepped off the transport shuttle at the Dominion testing grounds with the kind of casual confidence that suggested she'd either completely misunderstood the gravity of her situation or possessed information that everyone else was lacking. She was tall by human standards, with dark skin, silver-streaked hair pulled back in a functional bun, and clothes that prioritized utility over the kind of diplomatic fashion statements that most species used to establish their place in the cosmic pecking order. To the assembled alien dignitaries, she looked like someone who'd gotten lost on her way to a university lecture and somehow ended up at the galaxy's most exclusive gladiatorial arena. Commander Krelvash of the Hexapod Dominion clicked his 6 primary mandibles in what passed for amusement among his species. His kind had evolved from something that resembled a cross between a praying mantis and a particularly aggressive philosophy professor, and they'd spent the last millennium perfecting the art of looking down on other species, despite being physically incapable of looking up due to their exoskeleton design. "Welcome to the testing grounds, human academic," he said, his voice carrying the kind of patronizing tone typically reserved for explaining basic concepts to particularly slow children. "We trust you're here to observe the trials, perhaps to gather data for one of your species' charming little research projects?" "Actually," Phoenix replied, adjusting the strap of her equipment case, "I'm here to challenge Maltheos." The silence that followed was the kind of quiet that typically preceded either profound revelations or spectacular explosions. In this case, it was the sound of several hundred highly evolved intelligences trying to process what they'd just heard, while simultaneously calculating the odds that they'd somehow misunderstood the humans' primitive communication methods. Zixandra, whose species existed as pure energy patterns housed in containment fields that looked like someone had challenged a rainbow to a fight and lost, pulsed through several colors that didn't have names in any language spoken by beings still bound by physical forms. "Challenge Maltheos?" Her voice resonated through harmonics that made nearby crystalline structures spontaneously rearrange themselves into aesthetically pleasing formations. "You wish to face the Void Render in formal combat?" "That's right," Phoenix said, seemingly oblivious to the fact that she'd just suggested something roughly equivalent to challenging a hurricane to single combat while armed with a particularly stern lecture about weather patterns. The reaction was immediate and predictable. The assembled dignitaries began making sounds that the universal translators struggled to render into coherent concepts, producing a cacophony that resembled what might happen if several different species of whale decided to debate the finer points of quantum mechanics while simultaneously experiencing existential crises. Commander Krelvash's mandibles were clicking so rapidly they produced a sound like hail on a metal roof. "My dear human, perhaps you don't fully comprehend what you're suggesting. Maltheos isn't merely dangerous, he exists partially outside conventional reality. He has unmade entire star systems by acknowledging their existence too forcefully. The last entity that challenged him was the cosmic titan of Andromeda, and that was before we had to invent new categories of non-existence to describe what happened to him." "Sounds challenging," Phoenix replied, with the kind of understated enthusiasm that suggested she'd either completely missed the point or was operating on information that made everyone else's concerns seem adorably quaint. What followed was the kind of bureaucratic scramble that typically required emergency sessions, crisis management committees, and at least one species-wide reconsideration of fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. The idea that a human, a species whose greatest military achievement was figuring out how to make things explode more efficiently, wanted to challenge the galaxy's apex predator was so absurd it had wrapped around the spectrum of impossibility and landed somewhere in the neighborhood of cosmic comedy. But the hegemony had a weakness that would prove to be their undoing. They found the whole situation absolutely hilarious. Within hours, news of the humans' challenge had spread through galactic civilization like wildfire through a paperwork factory. Emergency broadcasting networks activated. Betting pools were established with the kind of mathematical precision typically reserved for calculating orbital mechanics. Several species entertainment industries went into overdrive, producing promotional materials for what they were calling the Great Futility Spectacular of the Millennium. The consensus was unanimous. This would be the most educational demonstration of natural selection since the Krexnis discovered that highly flammable and primary building material were concepts that didn't play well together. Very well, Commander Krelvash announced, after the Emergency Council had concluded their deliberations and finished placing their bets. We shall arrange for the trial, though we feel obligated to inform you that spectators typically observe from a minimum distance of 3 solar systems, and even then we recommend updating your wills and making peace with whatever deities your species favors. I appreciate the concern, Phoenix said, patting her equipment case with the affection typically reserved for beloved pets, or particularly reliable pieces of machinery. The journey to the Null sector took 5 standard days aboard the observation vessel Calculated Optimism, a name that became increasingly ironic as the trip progressed. The ship was equipped with the most advanced reality stabilization technology available, multiple layers of dimensional shielding, and enough emergency evacuation pods to accommodate every species known to panic in the face of cosmic horror. The alien passengers and crew spent the voyage in a state of barely contained excitement, like children on their way to the galaxy's most spectacular fireworks display, assuming the fireworks were sentient and had strong opinions about uninvited guests. Betting pools evolved into complex financial instruments. Several species started selling memorabilia. The ship's gift shop began offering t-shirts that read, "I watched a human achieve non-existence and all I got was this lousy shirt," in 47 different languages. Phoenix spent most of the journey in her quarters, working on something that involved a lot of technical equipment and what appeared to be advanced acoustic mathematics. The aliens found this both quaint and mildly disturbing. Most challengers spent their final days in meditation, prayer, or frantically trying to achieve transcendence through sheer force of will. Phoenix seemed to be tuning something. "Tell me, human," inquired Subcommander Thrumgull, whose species resembled what would happen if someone crossed a crystalline wind chime with a particularly ambitious graduate student. "Are you experiencing what your kind calls pre-mortem anxiety? We have prepared counseling services and several different varieties of last meal." "That's thoughtful," Phoenix replied without looking up from her equipment, "but I'm fine. Just making some final calibrations." Calibrations. The aliens exchanged glances that conveyed both amusement and pity, as if any amount of calibration could prepare someone for an encounter with a being that existed primarily as a conceptual threat to the structural integrity of space-time itself. The Null sector was the kind of place that made cosmic entities reconsider their career choices and occasionally file complaints with the universe's management about working conditions. It was a region of space where reality had given up trying to maintain consistent physics and had settled into a state of aggressive surrealism. Stars aged backwards, planets existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and time flowed in directions that didn't have names in any language spoken by beings that still bothered with concepts like causality. At the sector's heart, contained within a reality-warping arena that looked like someone had asked a Mobius strip to design a sports stadium, dwelt Maltheos. The testing grounds themselves defied description in the way that most cosmic horrors defied description, not because they were indescribable, but because describing them accurately required a level of mathematical precision that most species hadn't evolved the neural architecture to process. The arena existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously, maintained structural integrity through applications of physics that were still considered theoretical by most advanced civilizations, and had been constructed using materials that technically didn't exist, but had been convinced to participate in the project through intensive negotiations with the fundamental forces of reality. As the observation vessel approached, Maltheos's presence began to assert itself on local space-time. The ship's reality stabilization systems started working overtime, producing sounds that suggested the universe's operating system was experiencing significant performance issues. Several of the more sensitive passengers began experiencing what their species psychologists would later classify as existential vertigo, the disorienting sensation of being in the presence of something that existed on a scale that made their entire concept of existence seem like a rounding error in someone else's calculations. Visitors, Maltheos's voice arrived not through conventional acoustic transmission, but by temporarily restructuring the quantum foam of space-time to carry meaning directly into their consciousness. How unprecedented! It has been 7,000 years since anyone possessed sufficient foolishness to disturb my conclamations. The alien delegation immediately assumed the appropriate positions for expressing absolute terror mixed with profound respect. Commander Krelvash's exoskeleton actually began producing harmonics that his species reserved for prayers to their most feared deities, while Zixandra's energy patterns shifted into configurations that roughly translated as, "Please don't notice me specifically." Phoenix walked to the observation deck's main viewport. The silence that followed was the kind of quiet that existed at the moment of universal heat death, when entropy finally achieved its ultimate victory, and the last star wrote its final strongly worded complaint about the unfairness of existence. "Hello, Maltheos," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the ship's communication systems and somehow reaching the cosmic entity, despite the fact that sound waves typically required a medium to travel through, and the space between them contained mostly vacuum and existential dread. "I am Dr. Phoenix Blackwater from Earth. I've come to challenge you." Maltheos's attention focused on her with the intensity of a black hole developing personal opinions about interior decorating. For a moment that stretched across several geological epochs, while simultaneously lasting exactly 0 seconds, nothing happened. Then, something that had never occurred in the recorded history of galactic civilization took place. Maltheos laughed. The sound was like reality itself experiencing a moment of cosmic amusement, producing harmonics that made nearby gas giants spontaneously reorganize their atmospheric patterns into aesthetically pleasing spirals. Several of the observation ship's instruments began displaying readings that violated their fundamental design parameters, while others simply gave up and started displaying error messages in languages that hadn't been invented yet. "A challenge," Maltheos said, his presence expanding to fill more of local space-time. "From a creature whose entire species' existence spans less time than my most recent moment of boredom. How refreshing." The arena's systems activated, reality warping fields engaging to create a stable platform for what everyone assumed would be the shortest formal combat in cosmic history. The betting pools reached fever pitch as final wagers were placed on exactly how many nanoseconds Phoenix would survive before achieving complete non-existence. Phoenix opened her equipment case. What emerged was not the advanced weaponry or reality manipulation technology that most species would have brought to a confrontation with a cosmic-level entity. Instead, she withdrew what appeared to be a crystalline sphere roughly the size of a basketball, covered in intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow like living circuitry. The device hummed with a frequency that seemed to resonate with something fundamental in the structure of space-time itself. "Curious," Maltheos observed, his voice carrying undertones of genuine interest. "A primitive acoustic device? Do you intend to defeat me with sound?" "Not defeat," Phoenix replied, cradling the sphere with the careful attention of someone handling something infinitely precious. "I'm going to remind you of something you've forgotten." She activated the device. What emerged was not sound in any conventional sense. It was harmony distilled to its purest essence, music that existed at the fundamental frequency of reality itself. The sphere projected patterns of acoustic energy that seemed to bypass the usual limitations of physics, creating resonances that touched every dimension simultaneously. The music was impossible to describe, because it wasn't just heard, it was felt on a level that transcended sensory experience. It was the sound of galaxies being born, of stars learning to sing, of the first moment when random quantum fluctuations discovered they could organize themselves into something beautiful. It was creation given voice. Existence itself learning to harmonize with the cosmic background radiation. Maltheos' reaction was immediate and unprecedented. His dark matter form began to shift, patterns of energy that had remained stable for eons suddenly fluctuating in response to the harmonic frequencies. For the first time in recorded history, the Voidrender seemed uncertain. Impossible, he said, his voice now carrying undertones that suggested confusion, recognition, and something that could only be described as wonder. The song of first creation. The harmonic matrix, but the composers vanished eons ago. We never vanished, Phoenix replied, her voice carrying over the continuing harmony from the sphere. We just got tired of the noise. So we went somewhere quiet to work on the music. The implications of that statement hit the assembled observers like a collective punch to their species' respective solar plexuses. Emergency communication channels throughout galactic civilization began lighting up as the news spread. The human wasn't just challenging Maltheos, she was claiming that humanity represented something that predated the current cosmic order by several billion years. Earth wasn't a backwater planet, Phoenix continued, as the sphere's harmonics began to affect the arena's reality warping fields, causing them to stabilize in ways that suggested the presence of a deeper, more fundamental organizing principle. It was a recording studio. We'd been working on the universe's soundtrack while everyone else was busy ranking who could destroy what. Maltheos's form was changing, his chaotic dark matter patterns beginning to organize themselves in response to the harmonic frequencies. The entity that had spent millennia as a cosmic force of entropy was remembering something older, a time when he had been part of the galaxy's fundamental creative process rather than its apex predator. The Melody Keepers, he said, his voice now carrying harmonics of recognition and something that could only be described as awe. The composers who shaped the cosmic symphony. I had forgotten. The revelation spread through the observation ship's crew and passengers like wildfire through a library of philosophical texts. Species that had spent centuries studying the origins of cosmic order were suddenly confronted with the possibility that the entire universe was essentially an elaborate musical composition, and they'd been living inside someone else's artistic project without realizing it. You weren't supposed to forget, Phoenix said gently, as if speaking to a child who had wandered too far from home. None of you were. The music was supposed to be obvious. We thought you'd figure it out on your own. What happened next would be debated by cosmologists, musicologists, and philosophers for the next several millennia, assuming civilization survived long enough to have such debates. Maltheos, the Voidrender, the entity whose very existence had required the galactic community to invent new categories of existential threat, began to lower himself toward the arena's platform. His dark matter form flowed like living music, reorganizing itself until he was kneeling. "Forgive me, Melody Keeper," he said, his voice now carrying harmonies that made the arena's crystalline structures ring like cosmic bells. "I had lost the song. I became discord, where I should have remained harmony." The alien delegation, meanwhile, was experiencing the kind of collective mental breakdown typically reserved for species that had just discovered their entire understanding of existence was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the universe's operating manual. Emergency protocols activated throughout galactic civilization as the news spread. The galaxy's most feared entity was kneeling before a human who had just casually revealed that her species had composed reality itself. "There's nothing to forgive," Phoenix said, her tone carrying the patient warmth of a teacher who had just helped a student solve a particularly difficult problem. "You're all part of the music. You just got a little off-key. That's what happens when you spend too much time focusing on the drums and forget about the melody." As the implications of that statement began to percolate through the observation ship's communication systems, emergency sessions were called throughout galactic civilization. Ancient archives were frantically searched for any reference to melody keepers or cosmic composers. Several species' entire governmental structures began what could charitably be called comprehensive reality recalibration. The universal dominion scale, that monument to organized cosmic paranoia, suddenly seemed laughably irrelevant. How do you rank the relative threat levels of various entities when you've just discovered that existence itself is basically a very large, very complex musical performance? 6 months later, galactic civilization had undergone what historians would politely term fundamental conceptual restructuring, and everyone else called "that time we found out reality has been a song all along and we'd been tone deaf the entire time." The universal dominion scale had been replaced by the resonance registry, a new system that catalogued cosmic entities based on their harmonic contributions to the universal symphony rather than their capacity for destruction. Maltheos had been redesignated from cosmic threat level absolute to lead bassist, entropy section, a title he wore with considerably more dignity than his previous classification. Humanity's status in galactic affairs had undergone what could generously be called dramatic upward revision. Their observer status had been upgraded to Harmony Guardians, a position that came with responsibilities including cosmic tuning adjustments, reality acoustics maintenance, and the occasional intervention when younger species got too enthusiastic with their reality warping experiments and started producing what the Harmony Council had officially classified as cosmic noise pollution. Dr. Phoenix Blackwater had reluctantly accepted the position of chief acoustic engineer for the Galactic Symphony project, a job that primarily involved explaining to various species why their attempts at improving local space-time kept producing what sounded like dying whales trapped in a dimension made entirely of feedback loops. The discovery that the universe was essentially a vast musical composition created by humanity's ancestors had required extensive rewrites of every physics textbook ever written. Several species had gone through what could charitably be called epistemological identity crises, upon learning that their entire understanding of cosmic evolution had been roughly as accurate as trying to understand a symphony by analyzing the individual sound waves. But perhaps the most significant change was in how galactic civilization viewed conflict itself. The old obsession with ranking destructive capabilities had given way to something more nuanced, an understanding that true power lay not in the ability to unmake reality, but in the wisdom to help it find its proper rhythm. Of course, this didn't stop various species from speculating about what other retired cosmic musicians might be hiding throughout the galaxy. Current theories suggested that Earth's dolphins were actually the universe's original percussion section, and there was a suspiciously large betting pool on whether humanity's jazz musicians were secretly conducting advanced experiments in dimensional harmony. Given everything else they'd learned about their primitive human neighbors, it didn't seem entirely impossible. As Phoenix often observed during her new diplomatic duties, usually while fixing some species' accidentally catastrophic attempts at reality modification, the universe had always been trying to teach everyone the same lesson. They'd just been listening to the wrong frequencies. The joke, of course, was that they'd spent billions of years obsessing over who could destroy the most, while completely missing the fact that someone had been composing the whole time. Some punchlines, it turned out, were worth waiting for the right audience.